Hey, it's your boy Metagame Explained, or you know what? You just call me Bradford. That's cool. So we're gonna be doing a WoW TCG Classic tier list today. As you can see, I've laid out a very nice, very consistent grid where it's just heroes and not other card types. So what after that we're gonna be doing is I'm gonna go ahead and show you a grid here. Now this is extremely precise, this rating system. So there's no way something can get miscategorized. And if it does get miscategorized, it's your fault. And the same way these tier lists have S tier through D. S tier is the best, D tier is the worst. Here's the way I decided to do it for this game, for Classic. S tier is typically the best decks, often wins by default or has unintended interactions that lead to like a broken combo or something that you're just not really prepared to deal with, or something that's just typically too fast for most decks to play with. So it's just couple cards that were designed that decks take advantage of, and it's kind of unintended, but it's strong enough to put it in the S tier. Usually has high win percentage versus every archetype, so it's not particularly weak to aggro or control or something. It's just always got a plan versus everyone, so it's hard to take down. That's why it stays in the S tier. And usually requires niche answers. So and maybe it's a graveyard strategy, and this game barely has any graveyard counters, or maybe another niche answer that there's just barely any printed in, or maybe there's none printed in Alliance, but there's a bunch in Horde, something like that. Moving on down to A tier, this is where I'd expect most of the consistent decks to be. A tier is about consistently powerful decks, capable of spiking tournaments with tweaking, or luck, or metagaming, or skill. So basically just very powerful decks that work against a lot of the field. You can pick the right deck for the right time, and that's why it's strong, or sometimes it's just generally higher card quality, better decks. Down here in the B tier, I expect most of the slightly less popular decks to fall into B and C tier. There's tons of them in here. B tier, I say, is it's A tier, except it requires powerful draw or mulligan to beat the other tiers above it. So sometimes they're an all-in deck, and they just have to draw the perfect hand against you, like an aggro deck, and then it still loses to niche answer. So maybe it has to draw the perfect aggro deck hand, and then you still have like a sweeper, and it just kills their board. And that was basically the deck. So it's just so all in that it can win a tournament or do very well, but it's still going to run into matchups where the opponent had a niche answer, or you just didn't draw well, and that's why it doesn't rank as high as the A tiers. Alright, let's go see the next tier. It looks like a C tier. This one's because these decks are even more inconsistent than B tier, and often have lower card quality to achieve whatever their deck's trying to do. This is where you start getting into like mid-range, but it has strange cards because the person's trying to do like a magic damage strategy, just something where the cards, they're reaching for a strategy that's not really there, and they're using cards that are not quite as good. It can still work. You can still even win tournaments with these types of decks. It's just when these other things are around, they lose somewhere in across a bunch of matchups, across 100 games or something. They're just gonna rank a lot lower. And down here to D tier, you might be wondering, why even show these? Why show inconsistent or decks that lose to common disruption, or just basically meme decks? That's kind of what this is about. This age of the internet, people looking for meme decks. I think it's important to show that Classic is an enormous playground, and there's all types of decks here. And I don't think you're necessarily going to be winning tournament with D-tier deck, but I don't know, you might. It's not like the tournaments are that huge, so at the moment, it's just a random tier that's applied, and we're going to still take the time to put some decks in here, because most of these are pretty cool. Okay, let's get started. I think I'd like to start right at the top, and try to put some of the most obvious decks at the S tier, since I know that's what you're looking for. With my scale down here, I didn't exactly put all heroes. I wanted to put a variety of cards that identify the heroes in some cases. So let's just get started. S tier, I think right away we're going to put the Rune of Vengeance combo deck. The Blood Elf version is just so strong against a variety of decks. It can go slow, it can go fast, it's got backup plans, it's got recursion and draw, it's got interruption. It gets to play a lot of very strong cards, and it's got a very consistent game plan. Except against Ulthok, it just doesn't really play against that card. Mogdar is another Rune of Vengeance combo deck that's just so fast, and it's quite consistent. It's not that hard to disrupt, so I think that might put it down closer to A or B, but across the number of games it gets, just how fast it is, it's a little too unfair. I think that's why we put it up here in the S, maybe A, but I just don't think it's going to survive. So I think as long as this remains in the metagame, these Rune of Vengeance combo decks, they're going to stay S, because you either have a way to deal with them, or you're definitely going to you know, a number of people will lose against them along the way if the pilots are good. So here's the Rune of Vengeance and Big Boy Azeloth. Kind of represent these combo decks. Okay, another combo deck up here that's not particularly proactive is Balance Spirit of Redemption Priest. Here it is. Now this is a deck that he made up where you basically just make your hero go invulnerable as long as you have an ally in play. And then your hero can't leave play. And then as long as you have Kill Ruck or another unkillable ally, the Obsidian Colossus, which are neutral, so you can play this same style of deck as a Horde Priest as well, this Spirit of Redemption Master Hero deck. But it gets to play kind of a lockout deck. It doesn't really need to have a win condition. It just needs to prevent you from killing it and prevent you from messing up its combo. And once that's in play, it can just deck you. It has a reshuffle quest. Well, actually, no, it had like a shadow spell in it that was designed to deck the opponent. So it really is a mill control combo strategy. Doesn't really have to win by mill. It can just beat you with dudes, but that's its game plan. Other than just controlling you and locking you out. And I think this is another S tier deck because it's very strong versus so many weapons that can get thrown up against it. It can still get interrupted, but the player and the pilot skill matter a huge amount in this deck, and a good one can basically just keep bringing this to tournaments and it'll be an issue. It requires such a niche answer, and that is mage-style rituals of power, like silencing or arcane torrenting this effect so that his hero just dies because it has damage on it. That totally works. Unless they make their hero untargetable. They have ways that they can interact with that too. They can ulthok away your answers. And so this is basically an unintended interaction, this card plus Kill Ruck and Obsidian Colossus, and I think that just leaves us in the S tier where barely any ways to answer it, and a solid deck, solid pilot, you're going to continually put it in S tier. Alright, let's really start getting down to the more consistent decks that I think are going to be around for longer. I mean, when it comes down to it, my opinion is I don't know that Spirit of Redemption survives, and I'm not sure that one of these pieces survived the ban list. I'm sure one will go. Let's move down to A tier. We haven't seen a whole lot of slow mage. Very slow Drago control, but I think it can be tuned to fit better for classic. There's a couple sleeper cards that I don't see played too often. I think might push this deck back up to be a real threat. Even though it lost Blizzard, it can still, you know, slapping a slow on someone turn 2 or 3 and then just interrupting most of their cards until you get card advantage and heal up and draw more. And it's a very effective strategy. It just lost a piece or two. So slow mage, I think, has potential to be A. We just need to see a little more play tournament level. I'm going to put this guy in here. This is the Germans came up with this combo. This is the Tihan Zeren Draenei Shadow Priest that can make you discard your whole hand. It can ramp out a bunch of 6-drops and steal your stuff. It's got a lot of powerful openings. And I think it's a little more fair than these S tier decks. It's still strong, but it has things that can interact with it. It requires multiple cards to be in play, and it has to actually invest a little more mana into them. I think there's just ways to interact with this deck. And you can meta against it a lot harder than you can for these, I believe. Okay, next A I've got here is Ghoulmaster Kalisa. This is a deck Woodrow made. And if you just want, if you have a friend that just wants to try the game out, give him this deck. This deck just plays nothing but giant cards, and they're all very easy to understand what they do. Like, they attack and they help you survive. They all do the same thing, and there's a bunch of them. And it's not challenging to play. It's just a bunch of big things. You draw a bunch of cards, you attack a bunch, and sometimes your opponents go fast and under you, but other times you just wipe the board and play giant stuff they can't recover from. It's a very tried and true strategy. Alright, and I'm going to say, now Nubarak's banned, and I think he will stay banned, so I'm not really concerned about that. But I think it's worth putting up here that I think the Anubarak decks would be A tier forever, because they basically just get to play mid-range or interactive control shells or interactive aggro shells and just keep putting Anubarak in it, and he'll never go away. So as long as this card is printed, I think he just kind of makes decks that involve it already start to bump up towards A tier just from what he brings to the table. And he shuts down opposing graveyard stuff. He does a whole lot. So I think he deserves a slot to just kind of represent that. That's why he's banned. I'm not going to do that with the rest of the banned cards, but I did want to mention it here since some people didn't get to play against him very much. Next up, we're going to put Vorix up here in the A tier. This is the rogue deck that does a bunch of burn and self-mill and combo finishes. And it's really just a control deck versus, it gets to control the board and then throw out some removal or throw a bunch of damage spells at your face. And it just interacts with itself. It kind of mills into its own graveyard. Kind of challenging to interact with, and along the way can just keep killing your allies, your equipment, your hand. It can survive for quite a while, prevents healing. There's a lot built into it, and I think it kind of plays itself out in a lot of matches. It's got discard, so you get to interact with your opponent heavily. You could disrupt them and then play a deck that consistently destroys the field. We're going to put Unholy Power Warlock up here. Now we have the Tyrus Blackhorn as the main version because I think it's the best. There's another version that plays an Alliance Warlock. That's a Worgen that kind of makes your... that's this one here. It makes your demons a little better. I think it's worth maybe throwing him in the B tier. I think that version's interesting, but not usually better unless things slow down. So we'll add him. We'll leave him there. Unholy Power. This has got to be an A tier deck. It's aggro, but I mean that is like a master hero. So they have to have ongoing ability removal for it. And the way I play it, the deck is heavily aggro. So they have to be able to deal with an aggro deck and ongoing abilities through your discard. And you have some powerful synergy cards in this deck. And anytime that they don't have an answer right away and you get an Unholy Power in play for 1 or 2 turns, the game is over. If the hero flips, it's just an attrition game. This deck has so many silver bullets against you that you have to be prepared to deal with it, and even some of its better draws can just discard all your stuff out, even if you had the best answers to them. I think it's a consistently powerful deck that we all have to be aware of. I also put Bogmara up here. Did I? Yeah. Another aggro deck, another Warlock deck, has discard. I think this one's probably a little more consistent than Tyrus, but overall not necessarily as over-the-top powerful. If your opponent has some specific aggro answers, they can get through Bogmara, even some of the more nuts draws. But some of the better draws from this deck, if they don't have an answer to Unholy Power plus the discards, then I think that just adds one more avenue that they can win by. But Bogmara, very popular, pretty easy to play. Lots of little changes you can make to the deck, but very consistent. And I'm going to put Deadliness up here. So Deadliness is a rogue ability right there. And I got a couple rogues to represent it. We'll do Gyro. And this guy is a great sandwich. And we'll do Rordag. So we'll do a couple of these rogues here to represent Deadliness as basically just a mid-range, grindy, 4-mana spell. And I think that is an A-tier strategy in Classic. You get to play like 8 to maybe 12 rogue disruption spells if you want. I think 8 to 10 is a little more common. But you get to play powerful early disruption into allies that are hard to interact with, and you just stripped all their best cards in those matchups, kind of like what these Warlock decks do. Heck, even this other rogue deck. Disruption is amazing in Classic to take out the early answers, the best threats. And then you just get to lay down your own threats that are very challenging to deal with in the Classic environment. I think these decks are going to remain very powerful. They have lots of anti-aggro, lots of mid-range, lots of disruption. They slot right in with, as they keep printing better allies and quests, these decks will continue to get better. Of course, abilities too, but I think the allies and quests slot in a little better. Okay, that's Deadliness Rogue. I think the next thing I would look at is Grand Crusader. I think I'd still put this in the A tier. Oh, like that. Here we go. Grand Crusader, you get to play a bunch of 2-drops, 1-drops, some tokens, and a Paladin deck. And then you get to slap this 3-mana enchantment on, or this ongoing ability. And it, Tempered Steel, it pumps the field. So you either, all your guys stay huge and you get to win very quickly, or your opponent loses his whole board and all your little guys trade up, and somewhere along the line they either have to get rid of this or try to deal with your board. And I think it's a consistently powerful aggro deck that you get to play allies that have pretty good powers for 2 mana, 1 mana. They have some pretty decent text boxes. And then Grand Crusader combines nicely with some other Paladin cards. I think it still loses to certain metagaming. Certain answers can hit it pretty hard. But it's just a consistent deck, and you either have the answers for it, or it can really outvalue you with just the quality of some of his cards. Black Ice Fizzle Freeze. He enables a lot of... He's not quite a slow mage, but he's a lot more mid-range. You could maybe a dash control, however you'd like to play him. But he can enable some very powerful interactions between his 1 mana flip and holding up Taste of Arcana. He's very precise at taking over the game with his cheap spells and then interrupting your opponent long enough for him to get a combination of 3s and 4s into play, or 4s and 5s that you just can't deal with. And then a couple key interrupts here and there. As long as they have ways to deal with your threats, then they can hold up interrupts at key moments in the game. Mage has always been a consistent and powerful class. And we've got one on both sides now, Horde and Alliance. And this is definitely more ally focused from my experience when you play on the Alliance side. Okay, let's move down into the B tier. And so since B was a lot more about... I think really it's like hyper aggro in general, just kind of going all in. So we got a bunch of these. But before we get to the like all-in hyper aggro decks, if there is such a thing as a B+ tier, I think we start there. This Unholy Power deck can probably be somewhere in the B+ range. I think right at the top of B+, I would put Deathwish Warrior right here. So Deathwish Warrior goes at the top. I think it's consistently powerful enough to almost put it in A tier, but it's always going to have issues facing certain types of cards. Or someone just blowing up his Death Wish, or blowing up all his equipment at a bad time. And so it's always going to have niche answers that can kind of ruin the deck. But probably still the best warrior deck, so we'll put it up as high as I think it can go for now. Although it has won tournaments, so just keep that in mind. It'll always get a little bit better as warrior cards keep getting printed. But warrior just feels a little too... I don't know. Maybe warrior feels a little too undeveloped as a class. There's still, I think, a lot more interaction and room for them. And this class, this deck is one of the better ones, so I'm glad we have it. Spider Solitaire. I just put up the spider to represent the different builds you can do of this now. Spider Solitaire hasn't really changed many cards since it came out, like, over a decade ago. Still fantastic, still a B-tier deck. It's just... I mean, what else are they doing? They basically have to draw well and still have to play the deck well, but there's more answers to it in card quality of other decks, and especially in Classic, what they're doing for the manas that the mana amounts they're doing it. It's making this deck look a lot more fair than it ever has. So I think Spider Solitaire still solid. We'll leave it in B. Okay, Searing Light Priest midrange. This is a Holy Priest ability that lets you turn abilities into burn spells or solid removal. I think this will always have Priest somewhere between B and A tier. That's such a solid card. It enables mid-range control and then even aggro to a degree. But you get to play so many abilities and just turn them into burn spells. I mean, it's so flexible, it's instant speed, it's very hard to interact with, and you can build a deck that piles in what are essentially silver bullets, or maybe even like sideboard style abilities, and then you get to just burn your opponent out with them. So you can build lots of solid shells around this and the other cloth pieces like Mini Voodoo Mask. So I think that'll always put Priest somewhere between B and A. Paladin, now that they have Greater Judgment, I feel like that's such a solid ability. You can almost always build a shell around it and end up somewhere in the B tier if the card quality and strategy are consistent and powerful enough. It's a little slow, a little clunkier, but the sheer flexibility of like variety of board wipes you can get between casting Greater Judgment and then Ruin of Recall to get it back. That's a really nuts combo versus a lot of decks in the field. Okay, next up I'm going to put the Winter Twin combo deck where you make Crabby Fin, a bunch of Murlocs interplay. I don't know if y'all haven't played this deck very much, but this deck is nuts. I mean, yes, there's ways to interrupt it. There's methods to interact with this combo deck, but I mean, it can be very survivable, very consistent, and just combo you out of nowhere. Turn 3, 4, 5 even. It's not like turn 4 or 5 is slow or makes it easy to interact with. It's a mage with a bunch of silences and interruptions, and I think like 12 freezes, a third of the deck draws. This deck is nuts, and if people aren't playing Winter Twin, it's very powerful. I would be afraid of it. And if you don't have like instant speed answers in your deck, then it can just basically walk in and stall you for a while and kill you. Try it out. It's not hard to play. It's not hard to play alone when you're goldfishing, but against a solid opponent, it can be. Alright, but again, it's an all-in deck, all-in combo, easy, has potential to disrupt, or they can play a removal spell at the right time, or Poison the Well, or Sweeper, or something like that. Another all-in deck is the Baba Ganoush deck. This is a 0 mana guy who attacks for a lot, makes you discard your hand and flip all your quests down. So he's all in. Like, this is pretty much what the card represents. And Balint made a aggro deck that utilizes a bunch of all-in mechanics like this recently. It was an all-in Triton Unholy Death Knight with old Rage Gobbles and some other stuff. So these super all-in aggro decks straight up lose to 1 sweeper. Or like a very well-timed removal spell that kills 2 guys and heals the player. Again, it's a niche strategy. You can kind of spike with it, but it still loses to also niche answers. Witch Doctor Kuzar. Witch Doctor Kuzar is... he lets you overload on mana. And Punti made a deck that was a hyper aggro deck with him recently. And some games really do come down to like the last wire, the last card you put into play, and how good was your draw. And did your opponents not have an answer? But the consistency of the deck, I think, comes from the sheer number of small guys and their huge stats. It's like a zoo deck with a number of ferocity creatures. And the good draws are amazing and really fast, and even the bad draws throw a lot of threats in play. Still loses the same stuff this other aggro deck does, all-in stuff. I'll say the same thing for like an Ashen Veil Night Elf deck. Super powerful. I'm sure it's going to lose to a number of sweepers or some type of combo in the opponent's end where they just stall for a few turns and then win. A lot of potential there. Okay, I've heard about this Ressa Trader Control Rogue. I think it's possible to be playing a very specific packet of Rogue Disruption and Rogue like stall abilities that you design your whole idea around just surviving, and you don't really need a win con other than a Master Hero, which you can't get rid of with Ulthok. So I haven't really played much against it, but I'm hearing it's pretty good. I'll throw it in here just because it's unexpected, and I would think a number of decks just can't interact with what it's trying to do, and that might win if you get to Master Hero time. Speaking of decks that are hard to interact with, here is a Harmonized combo deck where you just play a bunch of little guys with Harmonize and abilities and get enough Harmonize onto the field that you put a bunch of 4-drops in play until they are all free, and then you find a creature that basically draws a card for 0 mana, and then you put her back in your hand, and you can just draw your entire deck out and win the game that way, since you can just play a whole bunch of free cards at that point, because you get all these Harmonized creatures in play. It's funny, it's consistent. Well, it's somewhat consistent. It's not necessarily going to go through the entire tournament without finding a couple weak matchups, but along the way, you're this kind of a vomit your hand aggro deck that starts to win on the mid-range turns, and then you just have this combo hidden in there. Okay, let's add Zaretha Shaman. This Google Shaman is Control Shaman. It's a powerful shell. It has barely changed very much over the past like 10 or 15 years now. There's different ways to build it, but playing powerful control tempo cards and then tutoring up for the thing you need is a popular strategy. It's fun, it works across a couple games, and it lets players learn all the different card types. It's a good deck, but I don't think it's as powerful as it will ever be. It's control in an environment that favors proactive. Spark Shaman plays a lot of the same cards, totally different finish. Instead of tutoring, you're tapping things you've put into play and shooting your opponents for a bunch. But I feel like that deck does have a number of games where it's just a little too fair and a little too slow and clunky. So the B tier it goes. There's another Shaman deck we'll throw in here. The Totem Reanimator deck. These were a lot of fun to fool around with, and the new edition of the Iranak really makes this deck have a kind of a mid-range combo kill out of nowhere. as well as being a consistent graveyard strategy. I'll group this up here in the B tier. It's fun, and I don't know how consistent it will be across the field, but it's powerful. Other mid-range things. Let's look at... We had Tihan up here to represent the Shadow Priest deck. I also think there's a decent Tihan deck to pair up with the Druid spells like Earth and Moon, where you can get pings off of this, and there's a couple other Druid spells that would link up with Tihan, giving you like a decent mid-range shell. I don't know how... It's not maybe as consistent and fast and interactive here. It doesn't have dispersion. But I still think it's somewhere in the B tier and should make Balanced Druid a lot of fun to play. Which is different than actual Earth and Moon Balanced Druid, which just spams Moonfire. Very different builds. Or there's a whole bunch of balance cards. I think you don't have to play like full balance with Tihan. I think there's a lot of different options for how you could let that play out. I would put the Boundless Hellfire Warlock deck in here. That deck is also quite powerful, but sometimes it just doesn't draw the right cards, or its board wipe hits itself for 5 or 6 too many times, where you just don't draw the quest you need, don't draw the healing, you just draw the wrong pieces, and along the way you're damaging yourself. Here's Jasani. Now this is the dual class Druid Hunter. I think she's got a lot of builds to create. I think you can make a more proactive build, where you're playing Hunter pets and some Druid removal and Hurricanes, and the German guys, Philip, he built one where you get to warp and detract from beyond and use, right here, you get to use him at Nessingwary as your ability to help ramp. So if you like extra ramp utility in Druid, there's a lot of options there. I also think Jasani Drago control is great for people who just want to sit back and just kind of play full like blue-black control with some real finishers. One last thing I forgot about the A tier. We're going to call this the Blue Aggressive Hunter section. Some of them use the Track from Beyond Reveal Warp. Some of them play him at Nessingwary. But Sebastian and Philip really, I think, put Hunter back on the map, especially the reveal strategies. Those are blowing up. Those are a lot of fun to play. There's a variety of answers you can use to dig from that and just gain value while gaining value from questing, oftentimes for 0 mana. These aggro hunter decks were already a threat in Classic, and you've kind of given them multiple ways to go combo-y, with or without the choice of going Night Elf as Ashenvale. There's so many ways to take that. Some success with Dwarf Hunter. There's just so many powerful aggressive hunter cards, and I think that's going to be a spot somewhere between A and B tier from now on. But if you don't have a plan for it, it can definitely go through and spike a tournament. Okay, getting down towards the C tier. A lot of the times these decks are just slightly less consistent. They just don't always hold up as well. Up here at the top, I've got the Coat and Slash Rogue. I think this is essentially kind of like a Deadliness Poison Rogue. It doesn't have to play Deadliness, but can be a mid-range or an interactive or even an aggressive rogue. But you're utilizing this Coat and Slash to go fetch up a poison and put it on your opponent. That implies you might be a more heavy style poison deck. Poisons, opponents can either interact with them or they can't. Rogues have the tools to disrupt their opponents. So if you just put powerful poisons on your opponents and then took away their answers to it, then you just play sweepers, or you just steal their stuff, or you blow up their allies. As long as you can stall the game long enough and put it in a position where you can win, I think this deck is always going to be powerful. Possibly inconsistent if you're leaning too heavy on Coat and Slash, or if your opponent has... there's a lot of answers that can deal with it, but I think that's what we place it down here in the C tier for. Alright, next up, I'm going to put Pat Eschke's Elumeria Wildershot. This is a survival or Beastmaster? I can't read from here. But she's a hunter that heals her pet, and then she turns herself into a pet, so you get to heal roughly 20 damage. And it's a combo deck that relies on some equipment. And to me, it's just not that fun to play, but it's a great defensive combo. It's a lot of thinking that goes into how you're going to sequence your turns, and then it's not easy to play. It's not easy to execute with. You have to really memorize the lines of play and understand how to invest your counters and mana up so that you can survive long enough and then assemble the combo which is to basically get a bunch of infinite readying triggers and attack a whole bunch in one turn. Stone Branch, this is just an ally it's a druid that makes tokens, gives them ferocity. But I think Token Druid is a good strategy. You can either play hyper aggressive, you can play a little more mid range and interactive, but there's so many ways to go wide and a lot of methods to either make a minion go tall, like putting a Gift of the Earth Mother on them, or using viewless wings or other ways to buff a bunch of tokens. I mean, not every deck can deal with like 7 1/1s and then becoming 2 1s or 3 1s. Or even just a viewless wings kill out of nowhere. We've seen that be effective across a bunch of tournaments so far. So Token Druid. I'm going to say Spellweaver Jihan. This is just another interactive mage deck. We saw Black Ice. I put him way up here and have Spellweaver Jihan down here. I don't know if there's really that big of a difference between the two. I think the ice cards are powerful. I think arcane cards are powerful. There's options for both of them. I just don't see Jihan as much anymore. And I think having the ice survivability and like the flip where you get to guarantee an attack, like this is a card you get to use every game. You don't necessarily get to flip her every game because you're not always Taste of Arcaning or Force Spiking anything. So then her flip doesn't always have an effect. Whereas Black Ice is almost guaranteed. You know, sometimes you only get 5 turns, and if you get to turn off their best attacker once in the game for only 1 mana and no card, that can be the difference. But she's got Arcane Barrage and some other arcane talents to try out. I'm going to put a deck menu you have probably never played with before. I'm going to put Boggles, or Hexproof, or Spell Shield, as we'd call it in WoW TCG, or Pants Druid, which I refuse to call it. And this is just a deck where you take allies, put Spell Shield, allies with Spell Shield. There's a number of them. They're not all great allies. Most of them have Spell Shield and Elusive, so your opponents cannot attack them, cannot target them. You just put attachments on them to make them large. Some of them are already pretty large. And then you attack your opponent. The goal is to not interact. The goal is to avoid whatever your opponent's doing and hope to make big, fast threats that attack your opponent. And you win before you lose. It works. It works pretty well. Some decks have nothing to do against it. Sometimes it's just a little too slow, though. It has ways to go around that, but again, you're looking at a C-tier deck. As a Warlock player, I wish this was a little better, but this is the Dot deck, the Affliction deck. It's fun, but you probably have to play between somewhere between 8 to 16 dots. I think 12 is probably the sweet spot for me. But you play these damage over time effects, and they're just so slow, and they require so many cards out of your deck, and they're pretty bad top decks. They don't do anything. They just kill your opponent 5 turns from now. And sometimes you need better cards than that in play. I think they're interesting that you can design an entire strategy around just throwing dots in your opponent and then kind of not interacting with allies. You can just play more sweepers, or you can play way more defensive in general and just kill your opponent with dots. And it does kind of feel like you're playing the video game. That's sometimes the point for some of us. So Affliction Warlock definitely works in Classic. It gets to play with powerful cards. It's just a little bit less consistent. Next up in the C tier, we're going to put Daspian, a Strikeout Rogue. Now, I know this hero was also used in the Coat and Slash Rogue, but I think this shell is open for a lot of different strategies. This is specifically the all-in, basically affinity for rogue stuff. It's a full-on offensive strikeout deck where you put a bunch of weapons in play, sometimes 2 to 3. They cost between 0, 1, and 2, and you just make all the weapons attack. You keep growing the weapons up while you've disrupted the opponent sometimes, and you just attack as much as you can, as fast as you can, and then your hero flip can usually win the game for 5 mana if your opponent lets you get to that far. If they disrupt you, you pretty much lose. That's just kind of how it works. You know, if they kick out your weapons and you don't have anything to back up the game with, you'll probably lose there. But it works in a number of metagames and consistently aggressive, but not always consistent enough to win. We're going to put Utopia here. This is for Ramp Druid or Control Druid. And I don't think that... I feel like Utopia is probably one of the strongest Druid spells. It just clears everything. It's very expensive. It costs 7. But if you've lasted that long and you get up to 7, a lot of games end when you just Utopia the whole board. And there's no way for them to get anything back. Even if they have a bunch of resources, It just depends if you're now up to 9 or 10, you can start casting your finishers, which is where these control druids want to be. So I think ramp control druid utilizing Utopia will have a spot in the C tier for a while. It'll always lose to a bunch of decks, but it just goes over the top of some other things. And sometimes that's good enough. Alright, and I don't know if we should put this in meme tier, but I'll throw it up in C tier for now. This is your typical meme deck with Murlocs. You put 40 of them in, you play Poison Tip, so every time a rogue enters play, your opponent takes one. And then you play one of those spells that just unleash the Murlocs or something, and you just put a whole bunch of rogues in play, and they all shoot your opponent for a bunch, and then you get to attack with a ton of Murlocs. It's goofy, but it's actually consistent and powerful. And again, your opponents can either deal with a ton of rogue Murlocs or they can't. We'll maybe move it down here to meme tier for now, just so we can keep track of it. We don't want to lose you. Okay, there was a deck developed recently by, I think it was Tsuchin, however you say that name. He played the Paladin Priest dual hero, which I've really never seen played successfully, not in Classic. And he's got kind of a control deck that utilizes a variety of equipment that are pretty unique combination. And it's interesting. It gives him enough to control allies and still present interesting threats to control and mid-range opponents. Now, there are more than one Deathwing strategy. More than one Deathwing strategy in Classic, but I'm going to say this down here towards C tier is where we'll put Burgle Rogue. So Burgle Rogue uses Burgle, which costs 7, to steal your opponent's cards. It takes their allies, their equipment, their ongoing abilities. You just get to take their permanents, and then you get to play Deathwing and sacrifice all their stuff, plus some of your resources, maybe some of your other stuff, your other weird equipment. I mean, you're already becoming Deathwing. You're also getting rid of most of their stuff. It's hard to recover when you become Deathwing. So that's kind of the goal here. You could consider this a meme deck, but it's consistent. It's disruptive. It has sweepers. I mean, this Nathan did a lot of work developing this, and it's pretty funny. But I'm going to put it in the C tier because it's inconsistent. It's obviously playing cards that are slightly less quality to enable this strategy. So this seems like a C tier deck to me. And then I put in, this is the ring that you cost 4 at the start of your turn. It reanimates all the allies from the graveyard. This is like the reanimator for WoW TCG. And I think there's always going to be a solid C tier deck, whether people are playing it right now or not, where you just dump a bunch of guys in the graveyard and reanimate them. And you could dump giant, like 7, 8, 9, and 10 drop guys, or you can just play a normal game and just use graveyard enablers to fill the yard up, and then crack this out of nowhere. It's kind of like a surprise mid-range priest or shaman ability. Even though your opponent gets, a turn to react to it, but still the effect is just overwhelmingly powerful. Okay, speaking of overwhelmingly powerful, we'll put Devouring Plague up here. Now, I know we have Searing Light as another ability to kind of base priests around. I think Devouring Plague is such a strong ability. It doesn't really do anything to the board, but it is quite a unique win con. And I think there's always going to be a number of priests that show up here and there that you have to be worried about that may be a Devouring Plague deck among whatever else they're offering. Okay, let's do Token Blood Death Knight. I'm playing one that Woodrow brewed up a while back, and I changed a couple cards here and there to update it, and it's pretty consistent. It's slow and clunky, i.e. the C tier, but it can just go way over some other decks. It's got such big things that it wants to do, and if it can get to 4, 5, 6 mana and it's not dead, then you better have a plan to outvalue it, and I think that's fun to be like the biggest Abzan or Jundi mid-range deck there is. And in this case, it's the biggest, fattest, doing the most stuff Death Knight deck. That can be a lot of fun. Another new addition to the field here, I will put the Fire Mage Burn combo deck developed by Shade Healer. It's not that consistent. It plays basically a bunch of cards that looking on the surface, you're like, these cards are all bad. But when you start playing the deck, like, you can't believe the wins that it comes out with just at the right amount of resources, the right combination of cards. It's really interesting to see that that's what the game's capable of. Those bare bones wins right on the edge. Did he draw the right card? Did he get the right combination of cards? It seems like it took a lot of effort to brew that deck, so it seems correct to place it in the C tier here, where it's inconsistent, but still has the ability to be quite powerful if your opponents don't have high enough quality defenses against it. Alright. Combos probably get a little more consistent here. I will throw Og in here. There's a couple different decks. There's one you can play where you get a lot of mage, draw, and counter spells, and then you get to kind of just mid-range your way up to a Sentinel guy, get some resources, and give him like +7 or +8 attack, and he gets to swing twice with that, and that might be good enough to win the game. Again, you have Mage Warriors. You have pretty powerful class options in between there. I think it's a fine little C tier deck that most people just aren't playing against. Speaking of deck most people aren't playing is the Oboro Combo Mage. You can build your whole deck around this hero's flip. That's kind of the idea. Build up a big flip, and it's going to lose versus a number of decks, and it's probably going to win versus some other ones. So it sure sounds like C tier stuff to me. Maybe even D tier. Probably if we're being honest. Let's add Rip Through the Portal to that. That's another meme deck. It's a huge combo deck, but again, you're in Classic. People can disrupt you, and you're trying to play a 5-drop. Plus your hero flip. So it's got a lot of mana invested. Needs quite a few kind of goofy pieces that don't really do a lot on their own. But this is what the meme category is for, because they're still there. You can still pull it off in a number of games. You know, I say meme, but like I'm just going to face a flurry of people out of nowhere with these strategies. Like, oh, 50 Murlocs followed by take 50 from Azeroth. Great. Followed by cast 50 spells. Sure. I think there's more than one Ancestral Awakening deck, by the way. Zaretha is the obvious one for Alliance. I think there's a good one in Horde. There's a lot of good pieces over there. It's fun to play with. And I haven't seen many for Monster, but I'm sure there's some options in there somewhere if you want to try the monsters out instead. And then this is the Undead Rogue for deadliness. We weren't seeing a ton of Horde Rogue anymore, but Tesseract Rogue was very good, and people aren't playing it, but it's nuts. It's got so many combos built in, a bunch of disruption, a bunch of mid-range, just stuff that it throws at you. Just keeps 2-for-1ing you. It just feels like the Jund of this game. And I've got an extra copy of Mogdar in here because I think there's a bunch of Mogdar builds. For now, the big bad guy appears to be, Mogdar Rune of Vengeance, but I think Mogdar is just like a solid B strategy. Probably a high B, closer up here. Whether it is you decide to play, it's probably a little more fair than some of these, but there's just so many high quality cards that a good deck design and deck pilot skill, a little bit of metagaming could reward you with a lot of wins. Okay, Ring of Trials. I don't know why I left it in here. That's probably just for generally aggressive hunter. I'll just put it in here in the B tier. I don't know if it's going to be as consistent as these A tier decks, because they're going for something a little different now. They're more consistently powerful. This one you have to play Aberration guys, and a lot of them are weak. You have to rely on the card quality of the other cards to make sure the Aberration part gets to work. But when it was there, I mean, eating your opponent's stuff for free at those locations is very powerful. Okay, now let's truly move on to not quite the D tier. We've got one more C tier deck. I think I'd put Nasala in here, C tier, probably above all that stuff. But I think Nasala, most people are playing her more like crazy discard style, where they're playing like 12 to 20 discards. I don't know that you really need that many, but getting overwhelming access to disruption both through discard and removal and play, targeted and sweepers, plus Void Fire Wand. There's so many ways to just stop whatever your opponent's doing. Just tell them stop, no more fun, and then you just play something that enables you to win. That's a fine strategy. I think there's going to always be decks that can kind of get under it or can just go around it in the right way, and that's it's got to lose to something, right? Otherwise, it'd be winning all the time. Okay, now I think we're in the truly meme tier. Let's put Pinprick in there. I mean, he's elusive. His hero has 8 health. Like Dias to Dadak. Next. There's very hard to win a tournament when there's so many ways to just deal 8 to you. But there's got to be a metagame somewhere where no one has any targeted damage and you just win. Good for you. Let's put Kahul to represent generally like Tauren tribe decks. There's a bunch of mid-range options for Tauren. They're not super aggressive. They're not super defensive. They're just okay. So it's a D. I think it's a D tier for classic. But if the metagame ever slows down a little bit, giant Taurens are going to start triggering. That's quite the tribe. Okay, I will put I have Deathwing in here. I'll put another Deathwing down here. I think there's a couple Deathwing decks. I think you have Nathan's Burgle Deathwing deck right here. I think you've got Deathwing tokens through Druid or Death Knight. A couple ways to trigger Deathwing. There's the old Mage build by Hans Ho. Not as good without Blizzard, but there's a couple ways to build Deathwing decks. And I think there's always going to be some right here in the D tier. D for Deathwing. Now, another D we can give out is for Druid, because there's a Druid combo deck that ramps into Medivh, the Master Hero, and just starts putting other Master Heroes into play, like Egwin, and then gets to just loop that back and forth. And it doesn't sound very good. Sounds like D tier stuff to me, but I'm sure it's pretty funny. So it's got that. And we've got a couple different ones. I think we're going to wrap up with the coolest one. So we'll start with this one. This is Tiger Strike. It is an unlimited ability. So if you wanted to, you could just play a whole bunch of Tiger Strikes, like 40 of them. And I believe it's Cyclone Strike, where you can basically add a bunch of Tiger Strikes and then untap your hero a few times and hit your opponent for, you know, like 3 or 4 times. It's not that hard to do. Just got to draw the right cards that aren't Tiger Strike, but you probably will get Tiger Strikes. Okay, so that's like the almost last place, like Frosted Flakes combo. So I'm going to put Caligos above that because I refuse to think that it's worse. And this is the Caligos like Storm decks. Cast a whole bunch of spells in one turn, get a Caligos for free, so the rest of the game you get to duplicate all your spells, which is basically Pyromancer's Ascension. So it's a lot of work to build it up, and it's super fun when you do. Probably too easy to disrupt, or you just lose before you get it off, but it's still there. It's a similar combo to Abora the Mad. She's somewhere. There she is. We'll put over here because it really is a similar strategy. Well, tell me what you think. That's the WoW TCG Classic first tier list, I believe. This is the version in Reborn where Hesriana's banned, you know, Blizzard's banned. Some of the weird free quest abilities are banned. And I wouldn't be surprised if Spirit of Redemption or one of the pieces of the Rune of Vengeance combo were to disappear and shake this up a little bit. Well, thanks for joining me here for the first WoW TCG Classic tier list breakdown. That took a whole long time and wasn't just a short write-up. By showing this out, I'm just trying to show that there's a huge variety of decks, and these decks can still beat all the decks above them. You always have luck, you always have player skill, you always have there's new cards coming out. There's combinations people still haven't found out. I mean, Nubarak was out for a long time before anybody started toying with that. There's always a lot of pieces that you can keep putting together and brew new decks up. So this is fun. I mean, look at the variety of classes represented throughout here. You may not have seen very much Monk yet, but when the new set comes out, I think the new dual heroes plus the new Monk class cards are going to really start to change up this environment. So let's enjoy it while we have it, and look forward to the next one. Thanks for joining. This may have been a bit long-winded, but it's been a long time since we did one of these. I'd say forever.